Well, thank you everybody so much for joining us here today for our CMAS Science webinar. Julie and I will now go ahead and introduce ourselves before we get started. So my name is Emily Miller. My pronouns are she, her. I was a high school chemistry teacher for 10 years. And during that time, I taught in our alternative learning program. I taught regular chem, I taught honors chem. So I had a lot of opportunities to work with a lot of different kids and try a lot of different strategies. I was also an NGSS pioneer and advocate in my science department at that time as well. And I was also a PLC lead. So I got to lead a lot of data-driven dialogue and data chats, which I love. And now I get the pleasure of partnering with districts to help them implement InnerOrbit. And a little thing about me, I prefer savory food over sweet food. If I had to pick, I would order an appetizer any day instead of a dessert. And Julia, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Yeah, that is an opinion. I don't know if I agree with it, but well, good for you. My name is Julia Mota, and I was a teacher and a tutor in the Dominican Republic for elementary students for a little bit. And then I started supporting teachers and districts with their NGSS implementation for the last 3 years. Now I work as a district engagement manager for the East Coast. So I partner and provide guidance to schools and districts implementing assessments in their NGSS instruction. And I help them integrate InnerOrbit, integrate assessments. Yeah, in their instruction. And I also think matcha is better than coffee. I don't know if a lot of people agree with me, but yeah, I just love it. Now, onto our agenda for today. So our goal is actually to model how to facilitate an item analysis BD session looking at three-dimensional items from the CMAS to help educators better understand how test items have shifted to sense making and how to use the SCPs, cross-cutting concepts in assessments and phenomena in a unit to better prepare students for sense making tasks. Now, you're going to receive these as slides later on this week, and then you'll be able to facilitate this with the speaker notes too, in case you're interested in doing so for the rest of your district or for your other teachers. Today, we're going to start by identifying sense making. There are some sample test items that we're going to look at, and we're going to establish what the difference is between representation and sense making. Then we're going to talk about how to scaffold towards sense making by looking at the CMAS and sense making and the NGSS and what those three dimensions are. Then we're going to go into a specific item analysis for 8th grade for the SCPs and cross-cutting concepts assessment tasks. And then finally, we're going to talk about how to incorporate phenomena in a unit, and we're going to wrap it up. Let's do this. I'm just as excited as her. So just to start, and this is just a quick overview of what InnerOrbit is before we actually dive into the meat of the webinar. The first thing that InnerOrbit is phenomena. And we have multiple phenomena, usually from 4 to 6 per performance expectation. So you have plenty of phenomena to use throughout your lessons and throughout your units in case you're interested in trying out InnerOrbit to get students practicing that transferring, because at the end of the day, not only for the CMAS, but the end goal of the NGSS is for students to make sense of these novel things. So we have plenty of phenomena for students to practice, for teachers to provide students opportunities to practice that transferring of what they learn in class into these novel scenarios. We also have questions, and these questions are scaffolded. So and Emily is going to talk a little bit more about how we scaffold our questions and how you could do that in your practice. But instead of just going into those big three-dimensional questions that we've seen in the CMAS and in other test items, we actually divide the performance up and scaffold up there. So the jump from representation to sense making is not as drastic, and we can actually support students through that thinking process. We also have reports, and that's one of our favorite parts of InnerOrbit, because it'll not only tell you, oh, students are struggling with developing musing models or this, but since our questions are so discreetly tagged, the data that you will get is so detailed that'll let you know what instructional next steps you need to take and be informed with that on what strategies are working and where do we still need to hone in on. So at the end of the day, this report will let you know where your students need the most support so you can provide that for them. And then finally, professional learning. So you're in this session right now. We host multiple sessions a month, sometimes a few, and all of the sessions that we do, and we partner deeply with our partners. So we have professional learning opportunities for them, and we think very deeply about these sessions just so that we can get everybody and support all teachers with their NGSS implementation. Now, Emily's going to drop a link in the chat. So if you want to talk to her, if you're interested in learning more about InnerOrbit and you want to talk to her about a possible pilot, then feel free to click there and make a meeting with her. And that was a spiel about InnerOrbit. We're actually going to talk about sense making now. So let's discuss how there's been a shift on these standards. And for that, I'm going to walk you through a phenomena that was on a recent NGSS end of year test. And we're going to consider the differences between these two questions. So one is a release test item from 2018, and the other one is a release test item from 2022, specifically from these CMAS. So let's reflect on the differences between these two questions and why those differences are important for instruction and assessment. So if you want to kind of like think about what this is, we're going to give you a minute to drop your thoughts in the chat. But just to see what these questions are about, the first question is asking you which of these is a biotic part of an ecosystem. Then the other question is asking, based on the information, explain how resource availability affects population in the pond between late August and late September. Your response should include an explanation of how during each of the two time periods, the plant population is affected by resource availability and the fish population is affected by resource availability. So you want to drop your thoughts in the chat when we see some answers. Yeah, so Carrie has brought up an interesting point. She says memorization of content versus application of understanding. This is so relevant as to what we're going to talk about next. Sense making versus representation is something that we really want to hone in on here. Let's take a closer look at this important distinction for science practices. Now, when we talk about representation, we refer to how students communicate their understanding of concepts they've already been taught, they've already learned. So this could be through diagrams, written explanation, oral presentation. It's all about expressing what they already know. So representation is particularly useful for diagnostic assessments, just gauging students' pre-existing knowledge, and also formative assessments where we monitor learning process and provide feedback. However, even though this is crucial for developing understanding and tracking process, it doesn't fully demonstrate a student's ability to apply their knowledge in full unfamiliar context. So if we're only asking these types of questions, we are not certain that students can actually engage in sense making. Now, on the other hand, sense making involves deeper cognitive processes, and it's about students engaging with new phenomena and using their knowledge and skills to explain why or how something is happening. Now, this is best suited for summative assessments that evaluate student learning at the end of an instructional period. And this is, at the end of the day, the ultimate goal of the NGSS, which is for students to demonstrate mastery of the standard through sense making. So this means that they can apply cross-cutting concepts, SCPs, and DCIs all together. And now that we understand these two differences, we're going to see how the NGSS is interwoven actually within this practice, and as well as we can scaffold our students up to that. Now let's take a closer look at the 3 dimensions of the NGSS and how they come together to support sense making. So first we have the DCIs, and these are the big ideas of science, which are the foundational concepts that students need to understand, like energy transfer, ecosystems, or forces in motion, for example. Then we have our science and engineering practices, or SCPs. And these are the skills that students use to do science, like analyzing data, constructing explanations, or designing solutions, etc. And all these SCPs are about engaging students in the process of figuring things out. Then we have the cross-cutting concepts, and these are the themes that run across all areas of science, like patterns, cause and effect, system and system models, etc. And these help students make connections between different disciplines and apply their learning in new concepts. And these dimensions all come together, and that's the whole point of the NGSS. So when students engage with a novel phenomena, they're making those connections and integrating all 3 dimensions. And this pushes students beyond just memorizing facts. It invites them to make sense of the world, or as we identified it earlier, and as we keep saying, sense making, which is at the heart of both the NGSS and what they're going to have to do in those CMAS assessments. Now, how do we scaffold up there? Moving from a single dimensional focus, just DCI only, to true 3-dimensional sense making. So we see a column on the left labeled DCI only, and this represents 1-dimensional questions like the one we just saw before, the recall question. Students are being asked just to demonstrate their knowledge of content without necessarily integrating other dimensions. And this would be representation. Now, to help students develop deeper understanding, we can leverage SEPs and cross-cutting concepts alongside the DCI. And by integrating these into the learning process, we create two-dimensional tasks that require students to engage more actively with the material. And to take it a step further, we introduce novel phenomena, which are real-world situations or problems that students haven't encountered before. And this process allows them to gradually scaffold their understanding and skills so that they can tackle three-dimensional sense-making questions directly. And these are the types of questions that students synthesize DCIs, SEPs, and cross-cutting concepts to explain, predict, or solve phenomena and problems in meaningful ways. So by starting with content and layering skills and concepts, we're setting students up for success, not just in an assessment like the CMAS, but also the ability to think like scientists and engineers in the real world. Now, Emily is going to talk a little bit more about what these items look like and how they're actually three-dimensional.
Thank you so much, Julia, for all that context and all that information. So like Julia mentioned, now we're going to take that knowledge that we know of the NGSS and how that can relate to scaffolding to see how the CMAS actually incorporates that into its questions. So the first thing to understand is when item writers are writing items for the CMAS science test, they're going to be focusing in on a particular performance expectation within the standards, or essentially just a science standard. So for example, they could be looking at the standard for ESS 22, which states, so that means it's a fourth grade standard. That's what the 4 means. ESS means it's Earth and Space Science. And then 2.2 is like the numbering system of that. And so this reads that students need to analyze and interpret data from maps to describe patterns of Earth's features. So this one performance expectation, this one standard, has these 3 different dimensions of the NGSS within it. So the SEP of analyzing and interpreting data, the DCI of looking at plate tectonics and large-scale systems, and the cross-cutting concept of patterns. So when these item writers are looking at a question, they're going to look at the standard, but they're also going to be looking at the different dimensions that make up that standard and then pull within those dimensions to write the item. So when we're actually looking at writing a question, we've got some different terminology that we can use. So the first is we can look at the standard and just simply write a one-dimensional question or a DCI only question, or as we were talking about before, a representation question. So this would be just asking students about their knowledge of plate tectonics, volcanoes, ocean floor. Just do they have the information in their head? And again, while this is important, it's not indicative of actual sense making and proficiency. And they're not going to see questions like this on the CMAS because that point of the CMAS is to see if students are proficient in being able to do this sense making. So instead, they're going to be looking at writing more rigorous questions. For example, looking at what we call two-dimensional questions. So this is where you're lumping the content with another dimension. So looking at the content through the lens of the CCC, like looking at it through the lens of patterns, or looking at the content while utilizing the practice of analyzing and interpreting data. So once you layer another dimension on top of the content, that's where you can level up to a two-dimensional question. And actually, a majority of the questions on the CMAS will actually be three-dimensional questions, where students are going to have to utilize all 3 dimensions in order to answer the question fully and correctly. And that's actually going to be the item that we analyze from the CMAS practice test here in a minute. One thing that I did want to quick show you is the CMAS. So on the Colorado State of Education website, they have what they call these performance level descriptors, or they call them the PLDs. And so what this is how they measure if a student meets expectations or not when looking at a particular standard. So just some things to point out here. The color coding that you see on this PLD directly corresponds to those dimensions of the NGSS. So the blue one is the Colorado Essential Skills in Science and Engineering Practices, which align with the NGSS SEPs. The orange is the grade level expectation, or in other terms, like the content they would be learning at that grade level. And then the green is the cross-cutting concept. So notice, even for a student to get partially met expectations, they need to at least do a two-dimensional with the SEP or two-dimensional with the cross-cutting concept in order to even get to partially meeting expectations. And then all the other levels incorporate all three dimensions in order to reach that level of proficiency. A couple of things on here, when you're seeing this PG5, that stands for prepared graduates. So like that sentence there, students can use the full range of science and engineering practices to make sense of natural phenomena, da, da, da. That is what a prepared graduate should be able to do. So that sentence there is saying they should be able to do that if they're going to graduate from this level. And then this GLE stands for grade level expectation. So the grade level expectation 2.1, these are what students would need to be able to do, what they would be expected to do at this grade level. And again, you've got the partially met expectations, approaching, met, and exceeding. So keeping this in mind, students are going to be asked a lot of 2D and 3D sense-making questions on the CMAS science test in order to see if they meet these expectations or not. And so what we want to do is we want to give students as much support and practice with 2D and 3D questions ahead of time, which means we really want to give them intentional practice with the SCPs and the CCCs ahead of time. So just to kind of show you what I meant, we're going to go ahead and look at an 8th grade CMAS science item, and we're going to go ahead and look at how this incorporates all three dimensions within the question. Like Julia mentioned, I will be sharing these slides with everyone afterwards. And the slides will not just have an 8th grade question, but they will have a 5th grade question and a high school level question analyzed as well. So you'll be able to look at or share or present information at all the different grade levels. I just picked middle school because it's in the middle. So the CMAS item that we're going to be analyzing together is looking at the performance expectation MS-ELIS 2.3. which states that students, to demonstrate understanding, can develop a model to describe the cycling of matter and flow of energy among living and non-living parts of an ecosystem. So in order to master this performance expectation, students are going to have to use all three dimensions. The SEP is developing and using models. So can students develop a model to describe phenomena? They're going to need to demonstrate the disciplinary core idea, the DCI, of cycling of matter and energy transfers, specifically within food webs. So this is understanding how a food web works and understanding the roles of producers, consumers, and decomposers within an ecosystem. And then the last thing is they're going to have to also leverage the cross-cutting concept of energy and matter. This idea that the transfer of energy can be tracked as energy flows through within a natural system. So this is going to be the lens that they're going to have to use while trying to answer this assessment item. So keeping these three dimensions in mind, let's go ahead and actually look at the item now. So the phenomena that students are going to be analyzing here discusses the ecosystems of Western Canada, which include mountainous terrain covered in forests that usually receive a lot of snow. Two animals that live in these forests are the Canada lynx and the snowshoe hare. The table provided discusses the main food sources for each of these animals, along with other supplemental food sources, as well as how they've adapted to exist within these cold weather conditions. The actual question that students are going to have to answer using this phenomena is students are being asked to create a food web using these organisms listed. So students will have to drag and drop these different organisms into the correct squares above. Within the item description, students are also learning the additional information that caribou eat shrubs and birds eat grass seeds. So using all of this information, students are going to have to drag and drop within the food web here. So now that we're actually looking at the item, let's see how each of these dimensions actually take a part in students being able to correctly answer this item. The first one that I want to focus on is the SEP, which as a reminder is developing and using models, specifically being able to develop a model to describe a phenomena. In this case, the SEP is really taking place within this food web. So the food web is a model of how energy flows within a system. So for students to be able to drag and drop the different organisms into the correct spots, they need to be able to essentially create this model to describe how the system works. So the SCP in this case is essentially the skill of actually being able to make the model in front of them. Now for the DCI, the key part of the DCI that takes part in this question is this idea that students need to understand what producers, consumers, and decomposers are within an ecosystem. So for example, the first squares here would need to be our producers, and then the consumers that consume those producers, and then the consumers that consume from there. So in order to get this question right, students need to be able to have this content knowledge of understanding essentially what eats what within an ecosystem and the role of those producers and consumers within the ecosystem. So the skill for the SCP is actually making the model, and they have to have the content knowledge of understanding producers and consumers within the ecosystem. The last dimension is the cross-cutting concept. And this is like the lens that they need to interpret the question through, which in this case is energy and matter. While this CCC is really closely related to the DCI, the key part of the DCI is the content knowledge of knowing the terms producer and consumer, where the CCC is broader in the fact that it's just looking at how the energy can flow from one organism to another. So it's understanding that these arrows here are showing how energy can transfer from one organism to the next. So understanding that these arrows are discussing that energy transfer is that main part of the CCC within this question. The DCI is understanding the different boxes and where they are within the food chain, within the food web. And then the SEP is actually fully creating the model. So now that we've had a chance to kind of dissect the different layers within an actual CMAS item, I want to talk a little bit about how you can help prepare students to answer a three-dimensional question like this. And the easiest way, well, sorry, not the easiest way, one of the ways to do this is to essentially really leverage the SCPs and the CCCs into different practice items, essentially making a two-dimensional question. So they're only practicing either the SCP or the CCC one at a time. So one of the ways that you can kind of help yourself create these two-dimensional questions, where you're looking at the content, but then layering in the SCP on top, is looking into the STEM teaching tools. So I've got a link for the STEM teaching tools here at the bottom of the slide. And what this is it's got different prompts within it that you can use to help create an assessment item. And they have different prompts for every single SCP. So for example, for developing and using models, which was the SCP in the item that we looked at, the prompt that we can use to help us write an item is we can present students with a scenario that describes a phenomena using text, images, video, and/or data, and a question or problem related to the phenomena. Then we can ask students to develop a model with components, interactions, and mechanisms that answer the question or demonstrate a solution to the problem. So this is kind of giving us a framework of how to then build a question. So to kind of show you an example of a two-dimensional question, I actually pulled a two-dimensional question from InnerOrbit. So we can see how it's really leveraging the SCP with kind of keeping this STEM teaching tools prompt in mind. So the phenomena that I picked for this two-dimensional question is talking about a Venus flytrap. So if you do not know, Venus flytraps are a carnivorous plant. So not only are they a plant, but they actually also eat different bugs and organisms as well. So the phenomena here is kind of imagining how the Venus flytrap would coexist within this ecosystem and what part it would play within this food web. So keeping this phenomena in mind, if we wanted to give students practice with a two-dimensional question, we could ask them something like this. In addition to eating living plants, some beetles eat dead plants and animals, returning their nutrients to the soil. How could the beetle's role be modeled in a food web? So this question is a two-dimensional question because, again, it has to understand this idea of consumers and decomposers. If you look at the different answer choices here, students have to know what those rules are. But again, it's having them leverage the SCP, how the beetle's role could be modeled in the food web. So how could we show this new information within the food web? How could we solve this problem that beetles sometimes actually eat dead plants and animals? And how could we then represent that within the model? So they're using their content here, but now they have to incorporate the SCP of using that within the model. So this is giving students just a chance to flex that modeling SCP. Now we can also do something similar, but with the CCC. So we can create a two-dimensional question with that as well. STEM Teaching Tools also has a guide with different prompts in order to ask students assessment items on the CCC. So the cross-cutting concept within our assessment item was energy and matter. And one of the prompts listed in the STEM teaching tools is when eliciting understanding of energy change, you could ask students, where does the blank get its energy? So this would be a two-dimensional question because you're going to have them look at some type of phenomena. You're going to have them look at whatever the blank may be. But then you're asking them where it would get its energy from. So they have to have this lens of understanding that energy can be transferred throughout a system and think about where that organism could get its energy from. So to show you an example of a two-dimensional question, kind of with that prompt in mind, I again grabbed an item from InnerOrbit, and I used the same phenomena as I did with the SEP two-dimensional question. So again, we're looking at that Venus flytrap. So the two-dimensional question with the CCC that we've got here is, each of the following statements explains how Venus flytraps cycle matter and energy, except, and then they would have to pick from there. So notice how they're not using the SEP in this question. So they're not necessarily using the model or making a model or manipulating the model. They're just understanding they're using their understanding of ecosystems and energy transfer and trying to think about how the Venus flytrap could be getting its energy. And this is one of those lovely accept questions. So they have to look at all of these and then figure out which one is false. But again, this is just giving them a chance to look through the lens of energy transfer, making it a two-dimensional question. So what's nice about these two-dimensional questions is it gives students an opportunity to practice the SEP and the CCC on their own. And then what eventually this can lead us to is getting students to be able to answer those three-dimensional questions. So essentially, if I took these two-dimensional questions and smushed them together, I could get a three-dimensional question like this. What could be added to the model, that was the food web in the previous slides, to show how energy enters this ecosystem? So students are using the SEP of developing and using models because they're thinking about what could be added to the model. And they're also using the CCC to answer this question because they have to think about this idea of energy transfer, and the energy just doesn't come from nowhere. So they have to think in that broad way of how could energy be entering that food web and that system that I was looking at before. So as you give students practice answering these two-dimensional questions, you're giving them time to practice those skills to eventually smush them together and use both of those skills and dimensions at the same time, which they need to do within a three-dimensional question. Whew. So now that we've talked a little bit about how that CMAS science item was written, how it was three-dimensional, and how we could almost break it down into just some different two-dimensional questions to combine into a three-dimensional question. Now let's just talk about how we can incorporate novel phenomena throughout a unit, because this is something that we have to give students practice if we want them to be able to do sense making. They have to be comfortable with seeing something they've never seen before, so they can then make sense of it. So in order to eventually get them to this three-dimensional understanding, not only do they need to be able to use their SEPs and CCCs, but they need to have a lot of experience with novel phenomena so they can eventually get into that sense making. So the way that I wanted to kind of give you an example of how you could incorporate phenomena throughout a unit was actually looking at an Open SciEd unit. Now, I want to be really clear. You don't have to use Open SciEd in order to use this strategy. I just wanted to give you a really concrete example, and then you could kind of transfer this to whatever curriculum that you're using. The reason that I picked Open SciEd is it's kind of nice in the way that it actually will list the different NGSS standards that are within the unit. So in this unit 7.4 of matter cycling and photosynthesis, these four standards are going to be taught within it. So I'm going to specifically focus on this one standard and how I could incorporate phenomena when I'm teaching this one standard throughout the broader unit. So just to give you a reminder, if you're not familiar with MSLS 2.3 off the top of your head, this is also being able to develop a model of matter and flow of energy among living and non-living parts of an ecosystem. So kind of similar to the one that we were looking at before. So when we're looking at this, whenever you are looking at a unit that has a curriculum that is aligned to the NGSS, for the most part, we're seeing a lot of these units beginning with some sort of anchoring phenomena. So for example, the anchoring phenomena for the entire Open SciEd unit 7.4 is maple syrup. So this idea that you can like put a spigot at a tree and maple syrup comes out. Now, a way that you can really leverage the anchoring phenomena when you're teaching a unit is to model all of these sense-making strategies for students. So you can think out loud. You can give them different wonderings and different ideas. So where did the maple syrup come from? What does it do once it's in our bodies? Where did that energy come from? So you're giving students a chance to watch you make sense of something novel, which will then kind of get them ready to do the same thing. So as you're modeling this anchoring phenomena throughout the unit, you're obviously going to go through your lessons. So you're going to do your instruction, you're going to do your labs, you're going to do your activities. And as much as you can, you're going to keep circling back to maple syrup whenever you're going to be modeling sense making. So if you do a modeling activity, for example, so if you're going to like specifically talk about the SCP, how can we relate that to maple syrup? So you'll do that while you're doing your lessons, but then you're going to want to take a minute and you're going to want to pause and give some kind of formative assessment on a completely different phenomena. For example, what's the scoop with worm poop? So this is a phenomena that is actually on the InnerOrbit website. And this is actually a pre-made assessment on the InnerOrbit website. So this little formative assessment has 5 questions that are a mixture of 1D, 2D, and 3D. And what this does is it gives you a chance to actually see if students are proficient with sense making yet or not. Because the key thing to do here is you have to give them a phenomena they have not seen before if you want to know if they've actually mastered that proficiency. So taking that pivot from maple syrup and showing them something new gives you a chance to collect that data and actually see where their strengths and their weaknesses may be. And then in a perfect world, once we have that data, we could then do some re-instruction of either the content or the skills. So if my students were really struggling on the 2-dimensional questions on that formative, maybe we need to spend some time focusing just on the SEP. If they were really struggling on just the 1-dimensional question about decomposers, maybe we need to go back and we need to just relearn what a decomposer is. So this is going to give you the information you need in order to see where you need to retarget that instruction, because again, they're trying to make sense of something new in that formative. And then eventually, when you're ready to give a summative assessment, again, you're going to want to pick a completely new phenomena to do that. Again, because if you want to measure proficiency, you need to have them making sense of something new. And what's nice on InnerOrbit is, for example, this one performance expectation, MSL is 2-3. We have 6 different phenomena available to you, which all have about like 18 different questions embedded in it. So you have a lot of different phenomena that you can pull from, so you can keep giving students opportunities to make sense of something new. And that, everyone, was our webinar. And I'm going to pass it over to Julia now to just quick wrap us up. We've been doing a lot of good work. We've been almost 40 minutes. I think we're going to end early. How cool is that? So Julia, if you want to go ahead and take us home, that'd be great.
Of course. And thank you, Emily, for going over all of that. We've done so much in just under 40 minutes. So we'd love to talk to you. If you're interested in piloting InnerOrbit, we'd love to talk to you, or Emily would love to talk to you about what that would entail. We offer free pilots. So if you're interested, please feel free to find some time on her calendar. She just dropped the link in the chat, and we're happy to walk you through and probably give your team some context on how InnerOrbit works. And if you want to try it out too, you can also follow us on social at InnerOrbit.edu on Twitter or X, and at InnerOrbit NGSS on Instagram, Facebook, and other social media platforms. But the one that we're most active on is always our YouTube channel. This is where you're going to get this type of content. And we upload videos usually a few times a month. So if you're interested, feel free to hop in there and subscribe. And then if you have questions, if you have comments, if you have feedback, you can always email us at inquiries@innerorbit.com. And we're really happy just to see what you're thinking and include your feedback in some of these sessions. But thank you so much for joining us today.